So as Reverend Tyler indicated there, well, I'll get to that. This morning he's going to be talking about the historic failure of religious institutions, kind of how we have not kept our covenant. I am not a religious institution, but I do have some experience in healing my own haunted history. When I got married in 1988, I recited the vows that I had written. I don't remember them now, but I think that they were the usual: love, cherish, respect, care for, partner with. It seemed so easy then, at the very naive age of 25. How hard could it be? No surprise, it was a lot harder than I thought. Worse, I did not have the tools that I needed to be successful. And I quickly found myself paying lip service to the idea of those vows while not living up to them. I was out of integrity with my wife and with myself. It isn't like I started my marriage on solid ground. The relationship I'd seen modeled in my childhood taught me that marriage was unhappy, disharmonious, a contest of wills to be endured. In mine, I became mired in a swamp of sublimated anger and resentment, manipulation in place of communication, contempt more common than respect. And I thought that was just normal. I thought that's just how relationships work. So I tightened my blinders and kept on charging forward, aware of the pain my way of relating caused my family and myself, and unable to change my path. There were good times, absolutely. And there were better times, and there were longer stretches of less better times. We worked on it. We had several marriage counselors. I had several personal counselors. And yet, I continued on my unhappy, hurtful path. After 30 years of struggle, I decided to leave the relationship. Now, 4 years later, I know some things. I know I kept doubling down on my broken system, and that served no one. I thought it was the noble path, that virtue lie in sticking it out. I was wrong about that. I know the pain created during that time was not relieved by ending the relationship. I know that I was fundamentally unhappy and unhealthy, and that my unhappiness created unhappiness for my family. And I know that I was out of integrity with myself and with my family, with the vows I'd written and with the values that I held. I can't go back and fix all that. But that doesn't mean that there is nothing I can do. What I can do, what I have been and will continue doing, is to find a way to being in integrity with myself and with the people in my life. For me, this involves really listening to the people who tell me the hard truths about myself, identifying the beliefs that allowed me to make bad choices, and replacing them with values that help me make good choices, and cultivating that small yet insistent voice inside me, not just listening to it, but amplifying it, encouraging and cherishing it. So when I stand at a crossroads, I'm able to find my way. I'm creating this new path forward, step by step. I'm making sure that my words match my actions, and my actions match my values. I'm not forgetting my past, the damage I've done, and I'm committed to walking on this new path. It isn't always easy. There are moments when I want to slip back into the comfort of old habits. And it feels so good in those moments to stay connected to myself and to my values. This summer, my daughter got married. Everyone was going to be at the wedding, and it was going to be at the house I'd lived in for 20 years and had not yet returned to. I was nervous about seeing them, about going there, I'd been walking on this new path long enough to feel solid in myself, but this was by far the biggest test that I'd had. So I fixed my sights firmly on three things: doing what I could to help my daughter have the day of her dreams, connecting with those who were willing to connect with me, and doing no harm. And I believe I was successful. I walked my daughter down the aisle. She said the day was exactly what she wanted. I had a conversation with my son and let him know I was ready to make amends anytime he was willing to allow me to try. And I believe, I hope, that my presence and my actions were not hurtful to anyone. I felt relieved, I felt grateful, and I felt proud of myself for showing up in the best current version of myself.
So, Greg, you shared some of your personal history, and I'd like to begin by sharing a little bit of my personal family history. My great-grandparents, the Connors, great-grandma and Grandpa Connor, lived in Medford, Oregon, and my grandfather, my dad's father, was born actually on the Klamath Reservation. They were missionaries on the Klamath Reservation, and my great-grandparents were very lovely, beautiful, loving people. And they were also people who were Pilgrim Holiness, which is a particular very conservative branch of Christianity, and who were very, very rigid in what they believed was right and wrong. And very hard on their children in what was right and what was wrong. My grandparents, my dad's parents, Grandma and Grandpa Connor, they took that love that great-grandma and Grandpa Connor gave them, and they transformed it a little bit. They said, we don't want to be the kind of people who require such stringent responsibility from our children. And they taught their children to be themselves and to do things in a more in a more expansive way. But they held on to the love that great-grandma and Grandpa Connor had given them. Now, my Grandpa Connor was also one of those people who went to war in World War II and came back changed. And he was an alcoholic. And Grandma and Grandpa Connor's relationship was very harsh and hard. And eventually he got into 12-step. But their relationship was one that was very, very, very hard. And when my father had his children, he took the love from his great-grandparents, and he took that sense of loving us and letting us be ourselves. And he also knew that he needed to break this chain that his parents had given to him of alcoholism and codependency. And I will say that all three of the siblings in that generation broke that chain in only one generation. They all broke that chain of alcoholism and codependency. But hung on to the love and hung on to the sense of expansiveness that Grandma and Grandpa Connor, and before them, great-grandma and Grandpa Connor had given them. More than 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago, the Central Pacific Conference of the United Church of Christ Board was invited into a project with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, and many faith communities across Oregon joined into this project. And the name of this project was Reckoning with Our Racist History. And it came out of a statement that the Common Table, a group of clergy and other people of faith and people of goodwill who have been gathering together, and I'm a member of the Common Table. We'd been gathering together for a long time, and after the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings in Portland and in other cities around the state, we realized that this group needed to make a statement, and out of that statement came a statement that said, we recognize that Oregon was founded in racism. It was founded to be, in its charter, a white Protestant utopia. And we understand that all of our communities, whatever our makeup, have participated in white supremacy. And so we will listen, we will learn, and we will change. That was what the statement said. And out of that statement, then communities joined together and said, how can we listen? How can we learn together? How can we begin to reckon with our racist history? And the Central Pacific Conference Board, so the board that's responsible for the 40 churches in this part of the country, had a cohort that was part of that. And we began to look at our own history and began to read what we call our yellow book, which is the little book that tells the history of all of the churches that, including this one, that were connected to the Congregationalists in the early days, and then the evangelical and Reformed churches, and then the UCC churches. And we read the white book that was written by Don Sevenson, another one of my predecessors. And we also read a book called Murder at the Mission, which was the story of the Whitmans and the killing of the Whitmans and the aftermath of that killing. And then I was prompted to read Juggernaut, which is the story of the hanging of the Cayuse Five, the people who were tried in a show trial of the Cayuse Nation and hanged for that killing here in Oregon City. And as I began to read and listen and study, one of the things that I came to realize was that I had shared trauma. And another book that I would recommend is Healing Haunted Histories. You have that in the title of my sermon today. All of this work that we've been doing for the past 2 years has been really heavily influenced by the book Healing Haunted Histories. And I came to realize that I had shared trauma. You see, when Reverend Whitman was sent out to the Cayuse Nation in Walla Walla, Washington, he was a Presbyterian minister, and he was sent by the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. The ABCFM is a board that I've served on. It now is called Global Ministries in the United Church of Christ. They funded Mr. Whitman to come out here. He was a Presbyterian, but he was funded by the Congregationalists. And when he got here, he at some point decided and wrote a letter back to the American Board and said, I have come to believe that the Cayuse people cannot be saved and that God has called me here to settle this land for white Protestants. And he became the main stop on the Oregon Trail before people came into Oregon and came to Oregon City. And when a group of Cayuse people, Telekite was one of them, realized that their children were dying from measles, and they thought that they had been told by a man named Joe Lewis that Reverend Atkinson, who had already telegraphed in his actions, if not in words, that he believed that these people should be wiped out and that the land should be given to white Protestant settlers. When their children began to die of measles, Joe Lewis told them, Reverend Whitman is poisoning you. And so they got together and they killed him and they killed his family and some other people who were there. And there was a man named Reverend Spalding who took that story and believed that the Catholics had been participating in the killing of the Whitmans, and they called it the Whitman Massacre. And they used it as a reason to take more land. They used it as a reason to attempt genocide against the Cayuse people. The genocide did not take. They are now part of the Umatilla Reservation. And I realized that I had this shared history with the Cayuse people, with the Presbyterians, with the ABCFM, Dr. Whitman, trauma that we share in this story. But then Reverend Spalding came to Oregon City. And Reverend Spalding told his lies about Whitman to Dr. Atkinson here in Oregon City. And Dr. Atkinson believed those lies, or at least thought that they were helpful, and began to beat the drum for expanding Protestant white people taking land here, to beat the drum, not maybe in so many words, but in actions for genocide. And I realized that we also shared this trauma. All of the churches in the congregational churches in Oregon for whom Dr. Atkinson was their founder, and also this church. And that was when I reached out to Reverend Marcia and I said, we have a shared trauma, and I'm trying to begin to tell the truth about this shared trauma. Because I only believe, see, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. tells us, we have to x-ray our history. And we have to begin to tell the truth about our history. And we have to begin to tell the truth about the traumas that we share. And only then can we begin to heal. That's how we heal these haunted histories. Now, I'm a Protestant Christian, and Protestant Christians are not very good at this kind of work, I will just say. We are very much all about, and certainly my great-grandpa Connor was all about personal piety, right? I am only responsible for myself. I'm not responsible for anything outside of myself. I just have to be a good person so I can get to heaven, right? And it's all about my responsibility. And it's very difficult for those of us who grow up in that culture to accept responsibility for ancestors, to accept responsibility in systems, to say we have shared trauma. In this way, I can learn from some other traditions, from traditions that are actually part of my tradition in the Hebrew scriptures. Right? We just finished with Rosh Hashanah, at which the prayer is, we have sinned. Not I have sinned, we have sinned. In the book of Deuteronomy, God says, I am a passionate God, and I punish those who curse to the 7th generation, and I bless those who bless to the 1000th generation. Now, I don't believe in that kind of a God. I believe in a God of love. But I do believe that those kinds of generational curses and generational blessings do exist. And I believe that those kinds of shared traumas can be healed. I also believe that the curses can only last for 7 generations and the blessings can last for 1,000, which is also part of that text. And I want to be the kind of person whose blessings will last for 1,000 years and whose mistakes will, or 1,000 generations, and whose mistakes can be undone in 7. And I think about, like, what if 7 generations ago we had begun to undo the racist history of this country? Where would we be now? If we could start now, where can we be in 7 generations? I also think about my own family. So Brian Stevenson, who is another person who is really important for me in this work. Brian Stevenson is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. There was a book written about him and a movie made about him. He's also the man who founded the Peace and Justice Memorial, which is also called the Lynching Museum in Birmingham, which documents all of the known lynchings. And it's a really powerful place and experience. If you can go, I would highly recommend it. Brian Stevenson says, truth and reconciliation are always sequential. They are never simultaneous. You tell the truth, and then you can reconcile. And part of what I am trying to do, and part of why I asked Reverend Marcia if I could come and talk to you, is that I'm trying to tell the truth as I have learned it in as many places as possible and hear other people's truths so that we can begin to tell the truth together. I've reached out to the Presbyterians, reached out to the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. I have some folks who are willing to make some introductions in the Cayuse, some Cayuse elders, and I've been told, like, they're not going to mess around with you. And I'm like, I think that's good, right? So I want to tell you another story from my own family in closing. Because truth and reconciliation are always sequential. They are never simultaneous. And when we have shared trauma, part of what we need to do is tell the truth with each other. So my grandma Connor died in February. She lived in Canby, Oregon. She was at a assisted living there. And my grandma and grandpa Connor, I told you that they lived with alcoholism and codependency for all of their lives. And they fought and traumatized one another, particularly in the early days before my grandfather found 12-step and was able to begin to do some of the trauma work and begin to work actually with veterans services to be able to do some of the moral injury work that he needed to do around his experiences of World War II. Grandma never had Al-Anon or a 12-step for her to help her. And they wounded each other so deeply in the first years of their marriage and when my father was a child. And theirs was a relationship where the children felt they had to take sides. You were either on dad's side or you were on mom's side. And my grandmother died in February, and I had begun to realize that my Aunt Becky was on grandma's side, and my father was on his father's side. That this was the pattern that they had adopted from the trauma of their childhood. And so we were coming together in July, finally, after, in this sort of weird pandemic world, to go to the coast for a week and scatter grandma's ashes at the coast. And I had heard some of the stories that Aunt Becky told about her childhood, and I had heard some of the stories that my dad told about their childhood. And I was really worried, I will say, about what was going to happen. And my Aunt Becky was really worried about what was going to happen during this funeral time. And we went to the coast together. And we sat together, and Aunt Becky told the truth about how her mother had been abused by her father. And my father told the truth about how his father had been traumatized also by his wife. And then they told the truth of each other. Aunt Becky accepted the truth that my father was seeing, and my father accepted the truth that my Aunt Becky was seeing. And at the funeral that they had for her, my dad was invited to speak. And my dad told this very complicated story about these very complicated people. Have any of you read The Speaker for the Dead? It's a book by Orson Scott Card, who I have struggled with now, I will say. But in Speaker for the Dead, the idea is that there are these people who are required to speak at funerals, and their whole purpose is to tell the truth of the person's life. And my dad became, in that moment, a speaker for the dead. He told the truth about all of the things that his mother had had to put up with. And he also told the truth about how the ways that she responded were sometimes not great. And afterwards, there was a reconciliation between my father and my aunt that I had actually not believed was going to be possible. This is the word. This is why I came here. Not because I believe I have it all figured out, or because I believe I know the right version of our shared trauma and the history of Oregon and how Oregon was settled. But because Brian Stevenson says, truth and reconciliation are always sequential. You begin to tell the truth, and then you can reconcile. And I believe that we in the Oregon Territory, not even just in Oregon, but in the Oregon Territory, have many haunted histories, many shared traumas. That if we are going to reach into the future, if we are going to undo the curses in 7 generations, we need to do like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told us to do, and x-ray our histories, like Brian Stevenson says to do, tell the truth. Amen.